I'm delighted that I can share a word of welcome to all of you and to Honorable Chris Smith, who is on the phone, literally in front of me, this little phone. He will speak soon, but I want to offer my personal welcome this way. And I wanted to stress the importance of the welcome. Sometimes words of introductions, words of welcome can be very formal. But when we think about slavery, we think of millions of people that are never receiving a word of welcome, that are always forced into an unwelcome space, into an unwelcome moment. Unwelcoming is the beginning of slavery. This sense that we can take advantage of others and exploit them and oppress them and make them object. Start from the mind and from the heart of us. And I am very mindful of what Pope Francis said about universities being engaged with the world as it is. Because the world is not good enough. The world is not just enough. The world is not as it should be, as it could be. And we are delighted that our keynote speakers that couldn't be here in person wanted to be connected anyway, at least by voice, to share this commitment and this engagement that is not just invented as something that happened on a day, but rather as something that has the power to orient a lifetime, a commitment of years and years. So I will do the introduction in two different ways. I will give the floor to Honorable Chris Smith first, and then do the introduction to the rest of the panel, because we have this phone peculiarity. But I would like to really offer a word of welcome to everyone, because for us at the School of Diplomacy, this event happens in the core, at the heart of our 20th anniversary. We are closing 20 years and opening 20 years. And when we reflect about the School of Diplomacy, we want to say that the School of Diplomacy that we want to receive from the first 20 years is a school that is engaged. It's a school that really wants to keep seeking the good of everyone, the good of all. Not just me, not just mine, but everyone, especially the most vulnerable. So this panel of modern slavery, global to local, this community conversation came to us. Thank you, Bob, for making this the second event after the one that you organized last year. But we are delighted that the School of Diplomacy is helping the university as a whole to be more engaged, more committed. For the moment, let's listen to the national perspective through U.S. Representative Chris Smith. As I mentioned, is the 19th term in the House of Representatives and served resident of the 4th Congressional District. Has been an advocate and a committed, engaged person working on this theme for a long time. We met in Washington, and he knew me through the other hat that I have of the community of Sant'Egidio. But as I said, we are delighted to have you, Congressman. The floor is yours.
First of all, let me apologize for not being there. The House is in session, and it began at 2 o'clock. And now we're probably going to be voting. Hopefully we're going to stop the government shutdown and then get the DACA, which is my hope and my prayer. First, let me also thank Dean Bartoli, for hosting this important community conversation on modern slavery, and for his extraordinary dedication to conflict resolution around the globe, including his tremendous work for San Diego. Dean Bartoli, I want you to know you inspire us all to pursue peace and reconciliation and take seriously our Lord's word in Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And you've been working at that for so long and so effectively, and it's a very tough arena. So thank you. I think we're all assembled, and you have a tremendous panel, and I wish I could have joined and benefited from their insight and wisdom. But as the prime author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, and 3 other major laws on combating trafficking, and one pending now, you may find it a bit unsettling to know that when I first introduced it almost 20 years ago, the legislation was met with a wall of skepticism and outright opposition. People both inside of the government and out thought the bold new strategy that included sheltering, asylum, and other protections for the victims, long jail sentences and asset confiscation for the traffickers, and tough sanctions for governments that failed to meet human rights standards was a solution in search of a problem. For most of that time, the term trafficking applied almost exclusively in most people's minds to drugs and weapons. The growing number of reports of vulnerable persons, especially women and children, being reduced to commodities, and as Dean Bartoli said it, objects for sale, and cruel exploitation were met with incredulity or indifference. The administration at the time testified at my congressional hearings against major provisions of the bill, and they didn't want to name, shame, or sanction countries with egregiously poor records on human trafficking, even when there was government complicity, because they thought it would be counterproductive. We overcame the naysayers. We persisted. It was bipartisan, and it took over 2 years to muster the votes for passage, and the bill was signed into law on October 28, 2000. Within a year, even less than a year of enactment, no one was arguing anymore that the Trafficking Victims Protection Act integrated 3 P's strategy: prevention, protection for victims, and prosecution of traffickers. Nobody was saying that was flawed, unworkable, or counterproductive. We did a number of things that were brand new. Much of the entire bill was brand new in terms of best ideas. One of them was to say that anyone who had not attained the age of 18, if there was just one commercial sex act, that woman, and most of these individuals are women, or there are some boys and young men, but anyone who had not attained the age of 18, that would be considered under our federal law, be an act of sex trafficking. And the person upon whom this crime was committed would be a victim, not someone who should be prosecuted. We created the T visa so that women coming in from overseas who had been trafficked, they and their families would be able to get asylum here in the United States and protection from these nefarious networks. The TVPA created and authorized funding for a large number of reinforcing policies, and what most people don't realize is that it equally applies domestically. It's not just international. The international portion got most of the publicity, but like with the definition of what is sex trafficking, how do you define it? Forced fraud or coercion after the age of 18, and anyone before they are considered to be a trafficking victim. So it applies here in this country. And what we did was give a whole of government approach so that every federal agency devotes significant resources and talent to end modern slavery, and we call upon the Justice Department to promote state laws so that every state would have its own trafficking law and have its own toolbox to rescue, protect, and of course hold traffickers to account. According to the Polaris Project, the NGO that operates our National Trafficking Hotline that was authorized by the Act, Since 2007, when they got the contract, there were between 38 and 40,000 victims identified. Now, not all of those were rescued. I wish they all were, but they had the MO of a person who had all the telltale signs of having been trafficked. New Jersey is consistently in the top 15 states for calls to the hotline, underscoring that trafficking is a serious problem in our own state, and that there is significant awareness of the hotline. There was a study done by the National Institute for Justice concluded that merely posting the number for the federal hotline in public places is one of the surest ways to increase not only rescue, but also arrest of traffickers. The more that number gets out, 1-888-373-7888, the more likely we will be able to rescue victims from this cruelty. Let me a very brief word about a new law that I worked on for 8 years called the International Megan's Law. It's designed to significantly thwart child sexual exploitation in the United States and overseas through a comprehensive and efficient system that warns law enforcement of traveling sex offenders. We know, and the empirical data is overwhelming, that the propensity to recommit, especially when there is secrecy involved, is overwhelming. The numbers are numbing over that. You know, you look at the most recent, and it had nothing to do with the International Megan's Law, but the women's gymnastics team and Larry Nassar, the physician, who systematically abused so many of our gymnasts. And I watched, you know, we all watched as they have made a powerful testimony against them at his trial. The propensity to recommit, even after a jail sentence, is very, very large. The House passed my bill 4 times, in 2010, 2014, 2015, 2016, and finally the U.S. Senate took it up and it was signed into law. Megan Kanka of Hamilton, after whom the bill's name, Megan, was just 7 years old when she was kidnapped, raped, and brutally murdered in 1994 in my hometown. Her assailant, I know the family very well. I know the parents who have fought valiantly to get Megan's Law in every state and the District of Columbia and our territories. Now we've taken that move overseas so that they'll have their own Megan's Law, but also become part of our international Megan's Law effort. For the record, let me also point out, and this helped us get the bill passed. In 2010, General Accountability Office found that at least 4,500 U.S. passports were issued to registered sex offenders in just 1 year alone. And passports, as you know, are valid for 10 years. So by extrapolating those numbers, there are large numbers of people going on sex trafficking trips, tourism, and that needs to stop, or at least alert the countries when they are about to arrive. Ernie Allen, who served for 30 years as president and the CEO of the Center for Missing and Exploited Children, very strongly endorsed my bill. And he said, and I just quote him very briefly, he said, "It is clear that there is a substantial category of offenders who do not offend as a lapse of judgment. They do it as a lifestyle. And these are the offenders who are most likely to travel to seek victims in places where the offender is most likely to be anonymous and most likely to avoid identification and apprehension." I was briefed by Homeland Security last month as to how well my new law is working, and they said that nearly 2,000 convicted pedophiles, obviously with valid U.S. passports, were denied entry by destination countries, and a couple hundred were denied coming into the United States. So and we're still building out this capacity, the noticing, and making sure that on the other side of that noticing, there is someone who will respond effectively to the sex tourism. Finally, in July, the House passed my newest trafficking bill, and I hope the Senate takes it up soon. It's known as the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2017, well, changed it to 2018. It authorizes over $500 million for domestic and foreign programs over 4 years. And we named it after Frederick Douglass, because his birthday, the 200th anniversary is coming up in February. He was born a slave in 1818. He escaped slavery when he was 20, dedicated his entire life to abolishing slavery, and after emancipation to ending Jim Crow laws, a gifted orator, author, editor, statesman, and as I love to tell my Democratic friends, they, appreciate this, he was a Republican. He died in 1895, leaving us an example of a man who did what he could to fight slavery in his generation, giving the gift of freedom to generations to come. Among many of the provisions of the bill, and I won't go through them all, but just one or two, and we worked very closely with the Douglas Foundation on this, was to authorize the Department of Health and Human Services to establish and support grant programs for age-appropriate education of students so that they can avoid becoming victims of sex and labor trafficking. The whole idea of situational awareness, let them know what it is, how the deception is perpetrated, and how they need to be on their guard and share that with their friends so that it makes the prevention piece becomes far more effective. We also work, and it's in the language of this bill, to combat supply chains, especially with government procurement. And the bill requires that government procurement officers in the United States get training on how to avoid purchasing products that have a supply chain taint with human trafficking. And this, I think, will go a long way. Again, they need to be aware, and it would be illegal for them, frankly, to buy slave-made goods. In 2005, I wrote a law, it was a reauthorization of the TPPA. It put in provisions that have still not been adequately enforced by either party, whoever's in the White House. This hopefully will help do this. And that is that companies, when they are selling to the Department of State, Department of Defense, or whatever it might be, there has to be a due diligence that none of their products have slave-made goods or have supply chain with child labor or any other kind of forced labor. We also, have language in the bill, and I'll conclude on this, that requires pilots and flight attendants who have airline industry-specific training. Delta Airlines and some of the other airlines have done great work in situational awareness for flight attendants. If it doesn't look right, alert the pilot, but then alert law enforcement, and during the disembarking from the aircraft, law enforcement can ascertain whether or not there's a trafficking that is underway. And many young people and children have been saved and perpetrators arrested because of this. We will do the same thing with regards to booking hotels in this language. A very, very, I think, effective way of trying to say when the U.S. government personnel book hotels, we will give preference to those hotels that have a situational awareness training for their hotels. Hyatt, some of the others, have done great work with telling, if it doesn't look good, don't take matters into your own hands. Let law enforcement know that they can determine whether or not there's something very, very evil going on with a child or with a trafficking situation. So that's just a few things. I know you've got a panel that is extraordinary. I wish I could join you for it in person. But we need to double down, in my opinion, on our work. There's so much more to do. ILO, the International Labor Organization, has varying estimates, but it's well in excess of 25 million people sex and labor trafficking. Some put it far higher because it is hard to get true statistics. So, just below the surface. But the more everyone has eyes and ears working to stop this horrible slave trade, the better. And citizens can do things. You see something, say something, just like in terrorism. Learn the telltale signs, and again, get that hotline and other. The New Jersey. Obviously, we've got a great effort going on locally, and stay in touch with them, of course. So, thank you, the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking, of course, who will be speaking today. Thank you all for tremendous work.
Thank you. your commitment. It's very, very important for all of us to be reminded that a significant portion of American leadership has to do to make the world better, and definitely anti-slavery is part of this commitment. So it's definitely an important commitment. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
So we are going to have this extraordinary panel. I'm delighted to see that we have all of them here, and we heard Congressman by phone. We are going to hear a personal perspective, a global perspective, a state perspective, and a local perspective. At the end, Fahim Abdelrahman will moderate the question and answer. But I would like to make a word of introduction, in a way, a word of welcome, in a way more personal, if I can, to the speakers. You can read the bio through the program. Congratulations, Elizabeth, and thank you, Linda, for this design. Very nice, very properly done. But a word of welcome because Ingrid Johnson, the first speaker, will bring really a personal perspective. The mother of a survivor of human trafficking, a nurse that encounters human needs and human experiences in a very personal way. So we are delighted that you could come here. Thank you. We have Dr. Bernard Freeman, a colleague at Seton Hall, now retired, but committed and dedicated to justice for a long time, and a fast friend. We just met for lunch, but we are already welcoming each other in this commitment. So thank you for being with us. We have Kate Lee, the administrator of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. And it's very important for us to have a sense of how the entire state of New Jersey, we just were reminded how prevalent human trafficking and anti-slavery work must be here in New Jersey. So welcome to Seton Hall, is definitely not anything. And then finally, a welcome to Bob Ronneberg, who is actually at the beginning of all this for us. He's the one that knocked at the door one day, came to my office and invited us to be part of this. And with Elizabeth, we welcome this opportunity. I believe that the university is going to be better. The university is going to be stronger, even when joins with people like Bob and like you in making the world better. These kind of campaigns require a very interesting fusion of professionalism and dedication. You cannot abolish slavery just because you want. You cannot abolish slavery just because you are dedicated to it. There is a link between knowledge and patience learning of how the human system works and should work better, to self-correct and make sure that everyone is welcome. So I'm delighted that Bob is taking the lead and helping the school diplomacy to participate in this. Welcome to all the panelists, and we are going to give the floor to Mr. Johnson.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it, and to be among the other guest speakers. It's just an honor. Seton Hall is my home, and I grew up here as a student. I'm a Newark resident, and the topic of human trafficking became near and dear to my heart because of a personal experience with my own child. So it's definitely an honor to be here with you today. I want to bring your attention, although Kate is here and speaking for the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking, and that's what brings a lot of us together. So I think it's important to acknowledge the coalition and the many organizations that it represents. here today because that's what's sewing us together. As Congressman Chris Smith so eloquently stated, that this has been a long journey. And so we need to remind each other about that thread, that common thread that brings us here today. So where is human trafficking happening? It's happening around the world, and we keep hearing that over and over again. But the one issue I had take order with is that people don't think it's happening right here. So I'm here today, and everywhere I travel to bring home that message, that people should not think it's so far away, that it is happening right here. I was a student here. I carried this burden with me as a student, and I had this experience. And so I think it's important to relay that to you today as you listen and you grow and we raise the awareness of not just the Seton Hall campus, but the communities that it embraces around it. What's being done about it? Prevention, education, awareness, and advocacy. And so I found my daughter who was a needle in a haystack, and from that day, over 10 years ago, I've been dedicated that I would spend the rest of my life giving back to the world and the communities that we serve to help some other soul who may be lost, parents who don't know what to do, and people who have a misunderstanding about what human trafficking really is, and they misunderstand the people who have been afflicted by this situation. So January, and we're still in the month of January, is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. People lose sight of the work that the great Congressman Chris Smith started and the work of the coalition members and the many community organizations. That January 11th is designated in our state Human Trafficking Awareness Day, but this month that we still embody is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So how befitting that we're all here today. So my story, which is the hallmark of what I typically share when I travel around, and I've been outside of the state of New Jersey in over 10 years. So my daughter, who's now 27 years old, was roughly 13 years old, and back in 2004, my daughter was an honor student at one of New York's finest private schools at the time, which is all part of here from the area. Newark One enrolls, and Newark has many magnet schools. So she played the violin. She was a typical A.B. student. She loved to learn, and she was just an overall well-rounded individual. But young people, they want to make friends, right? So who doesn't want to make friends? And we come from homes that produce students like Seton Hall has on this campus today. But in making friends, sometimes you want to hang out a little too late. You begin to break your parents' rules a little bit, and you're just testing the waters, and you're growing up and you're developing, and every adult can say privately what they did to test the waters when they were growing up, right? So, but then who becomes your friend is really important. People can feed you alcohol, they can feed you drugs, and then you don't even know what happened. So one day while my daughter was hanging out, if you will, she never returned. And I couldn't understand why she never returned. And so eventually, and again, for the time that we have here, I will go through this story and get through the slides within my time allotment, but just painting the picture for all in attendance, what human trafficking has meant to me and my family was a good child in a great educational environment, hanging out and all of a sudden getting lost in that world. So somehow she ended up in New York. She doesn't know how she ended up there, but my daughter ended up missing for 11 months. I'm a nurse by background. I was working at night, and I went to work every single night. Couldn't tell a soul because I was worried about the stigma that the place on my back. People think you're bad parents. They think everybody's on welfare. We're all so substandard, and particularly African American people. And so I went to work as a professional and kept this to myself. But by day, I was working with law enforcement trying to find my daughter. So you should know that at the end of 11 months, well, in the middle of 11 months, she made one call, and she was hiding in a bathroom at a gas station in New York. I missed that call while I was working, and then it took months even after that call for them to track the number and to track the area that my daughter was calling from. And then it wasn't even over then Then I was in New York on a regular basis, posting flyers, trying to find my child and working with the police. So it can become quite involved, is my point. And we're one of the lucky ones that I had a background, not just as a nurse. I started my career in behavioral health, so I understood the communities that we serve, the people within it, and I didn't have a fear of going to the streets to do what law enforcement at the time was not educated to do. So I was out there by myself. I hadn't even heard of human trafficking and didn't know we were even part of it. All I knew was that I was looking for my daughter. And it was after her recovery that I learned about human trafficking and that we unwillfully had become part of that. So today my daughter is 27, and I'll say that again, and she has a college education. She's working on a second degree, and you know, God is good, and I'm here to share that goodness with you, that people can be found and people can be helped, and we shouldn't give up, because although it's difficult to get your hands around this thing called human trafficking, and particularly within the borders and the walls of the U.S., we cannot give up on our children. It has nothing to do with their financial status of their parents. This has to do with humanity. And so this great country should care about the young people who walk our streets, who we judge about with the color of their skin, and we judge about their behaviors. Because hanging out doesn't have a face. Hanging out doesn't have a color. Having a beer doesn't affect just one race. People like to hang out and socialize. It's just what we do. And sometimes people can get lost in the shuffle of doing that. And particularly when someone sees you as prey in your state of vulnerability. So the world is our garden, right? You know, I think it's so important the work that Bob and others do to talk about trade and commerce and how do we tie together this element of human trafficking and the missing and the products that we buy in our community. You know, so I think it helps if we could see the impact that we make, how we can change the world that we live in, and we can just be educated and raise awareness and make better choices, right? And if we educate our children as to what's going on, they can then take the baton and pass that on. And one day, in somebody's lifetime, we could eradicate this thing called human trafficking across the globe. But it starts with us. This is just an example of fair trade and Trader Joe's and companies that participate in trying to make a difference. And today, everyone that is here is making a difference. You know, sometimes we think we have to do so much more to give credit to yourself for making a difference. But just raising your voice as we are doing today, and you being here to hear, and go home and tell other family members, co-workers, and the leaderships in the organizations that you work for, that they too should join us in making a difference across the globe. This is another example of a fair trade product, peanuts in the labeling. And also, here is the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline number. It can be Googled, you don't have to memorize it, but this is the number that Congressman Chris Smith is referring to. So it's very important. There was a lot of work to get down to one number. There are so many various governmental organizations that are working to make the world a better place. But if we all are confused about who to call and who to contact and how to do it, you can't get much accomplished in a world of chaos. So this streamlines it. It makes it simple for our communities. That if we see something, we should say something. And this is a way for you to say something. Community-based organizations, where will we be? Where did I go first when my daughter was missing? I went to the community. After all, where do we think young girls who are in high school, where do they go? What secrets do they keep from their families? I thought, is she pregnant? Did she not want to tell me? You know, so the lines of communication, keeping those lines of communication open with our young people is extremely important. And safety first. I always bring out with me that people should not try any heroics. You come out to seminars and presentations like this, and you think, well, gee, I'm going to see something, I'm going to do something. Well, not quite yet. You need to keep yourself safe and your family members, and you need to utilize the hotline and law enforcement and other avenues to not get yourself entangled. You also could blow an ongoing investigation for trying to be heroic and thinking you're really helping, but you could really hurt someone. My family, this is my family. Seton Hall recognized me a couple of years ago, and I was awarded a humanitarian award as a New York One, and so Galley event. So this is my family. That is my daughter. So putting a face on this god-awful situation has helped a lot of people that I've spoken to. There's so many parents that have trouble, even if they have their child at home. The drugs that are going and ruining our communities is real, and particularly when you have something else going on like human trafficking. You know, we were blessed and fortunate. My daughter didn't come home drug addicted. She didn't come home pregnant with the pimp's baby. She just came home. She talks about the struggle of getting back into the community and the schools and getting with the program, but she did it because she had a strong foundation and she loved to learn, and education was her thing. So think of the person who education is not their thing, and the lack of confidence that they would have to even just get started. What do you do? So before we open up a can of worms in people's lives, we really have to genuinely develop trusting relationships with the people that we choose to serve in our communities, because that's the first step to helping them. Because after all, if they can't trust us, then we can't help them. And then once you gain their trust, you need to respect that trust out in the community. And so my name is Ingrid Johnson, and I hope I've served you well today and brought life to human trafficking and what it means within the state of New Jersey, what it means in the community surrounding the South Orange campus. And so thank you for having me today.
I guess we're going to introduce ourselves. Silence. I am next. Hello, can you hear me? Very good. My name is Bernard Freeman, and I am a retired professor from law school. And I'm going to give you not what his movie is, but that it's an honor and privilege for me to be here with this panel, and I trust the same will be true for you when I am done. I'm going to give you my task is to give a global perspective on human trafficking. And also, because of the work I do, it will also involve some history, because that's what I do. I'm a legal historian. And the work that I've been doing is the history of slavery and abolition in the Muslim world, primarily focused on the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean world. And so I've been doing this work for about 15 years. And like many Americans, I assumed when I started the work that slavery and abolition occurred in that part of the world in the 19th century and at the end of the 19th century, like in the Western Hemisphere, slavery was brought to an end, and people went on with governments or colonial governments, sometimes independent governments, and slavery was not a problem after that. And then when I did the historical research, it turns out that slavery was not abolished in that part of the world, in the Indian Ocean world, East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Southeast Asia, and even parts of the Pacific, Japan and Korea and the like. And efforts by the British and others to abolish slavery actually did not work. So when looking at human trafficking in that part of the world, someone should understand that it's really just a continuation of what's been happening for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years in that part of the world. Living here in America, we have this very good anti-slavery part of our jurisprudence, the Civil War, the example of Frederick Douglass, civil rights laws, and all that kind of thing. That kind of thing just did not happen in the Indian Ocean world and in a large part of Asia. So also slavery was different in that part of the world. We have the transatlantic idea here. You know, we have the image that we're taught in school of the plantation slavery, put someone with a whip and people working in cotton fields, mostly African Americans, and or in the Caribbean, similar thing, or even Brazil, South America. Slavery in the Indian Ocean world was a much different phenomenon. So you had things like soldiers who were slaves, but who ran governments. You have legalized concubinage. In other words, women held as slaves legally for purposes of sexual enjoyment and other kinds of things like that. You had the use of eunuchs, castrated males, and a big trade in castrated males, not just Africans, but oftentimes people from southern Russia, Indians, and sometimes Asians, who were used and trusted and rose also to very high levels of government. So the anti-slavery idea that we're used to in this country just was not a thing that really was quite prevalent in the Indian Ocean world. So you have, my point in saying that is that you have many kinds of methods and modalities with respect to slavery in the Indian Ocean world that are different from what we have here in the West, and also did not disappear with the worldwide effort to abolish slavery at the end of the 19th century. So when I talk about this, I talk about those particular places. I think I would call them hotspots. There were hotspots for slavery in the 19th century, and they remain hotspots of slavery and human trafficking in the 20th and 21st century. The Persian Gulf. People being transported into the Persian Gulf. In the 19th century, they were brought there to dive for dates, or dive for pearls, to work date farms, to work other kinds of, similar kinds of, almost like plantation type work, but in great numbers. In the Persian Gulf today, people are brought from India and from Africa and Southeast Asia in great numbers to do work on construction projects and other large-scale projects. Qatar is about to have the World Cup soccer match in 2020 or 22, somewhere soon, and they're trying to give the impression that they are now anti-slavery, but in fact, there is a great number of people that are working there under very horrific conditions, and other parts of the Persian Gulf as well. On the Arabian Peninsula, there are great numbers of women, mostly women, sometimes boys and men, who are in horrible situations. I ran a study abroad program in Jordan, and some of my students connected with, there is an anti-slavery organization in Jordan, and my student went there to volunteer as an intern, and we had a woman come in, a Filipino woman, came in. She had run away from the household that she was working in. She had worked in the household for 8 years, had never been paid, not 1 cent. Slept on the floor in the kitchen of the household, attended to the children, attended to other things in the house, a sexual plaything for the young boys in the house, and her effort was to get away from that after 8 years. The Jordanian police, if she had no papers, so if she had gone to the Jordanian police, what the Jordanian police would have done is to take her back to that family where she would be beaten and kept in that circumstance. And these kinds of things go on in quite a few countries all over that part of the world. North Africa is another place where you had in the 19th century people being transported across the Sahara Desert, and then after they're transported across the Sahara Desert, they would be sold in cities like Cairo, Tunis, Algiers, Tangiers, and then transported elsewhere. That's still happening today, although the reasons for it are different. It's a great migration because of economic inequality, but still the use of these methods to transport and traffic people are still very much in play. India, I don't think many of you may know from your reading that you have children and others working in factories and looms and mines in India problem today, as well as Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia. There are really severe problems in terms of people working in the fishing industry, in mining again, in agriculture, and those kinds of things happened in the 19th century. It's really not much different than what had happened before. Now, anti-slavery is seen by many people as a human rights issue. An important thing happened, and I'm sure Congressman Smith would agree with this. His work has been tremendous. But on the international front, the UN adopted what's called the Palermo Protocol, which was adopted near and about the same time as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act here in the United States. And the Palermo Protocol shifts the approach to slavery and human trafficking from a human rights issue to an issue involving organized crime. And organized crime is really what I think this problem is about. Yes, it's a human rights issue. We shouldn't deny that putting someone in a slavery circumstance is a denial of their human rights. But really, in order to combat it, we have to understand that there are organized criminal enterprises. It could be just two people, a husband and wife, but sometimes it's actually a big organization that causes people to come into this circumstance. So one thing that organized crime, I've had clients in the mafia, and I understand how they work. They depend on the acceptance of the population for their existence. They want people to be quiet, to cooperate with them, to not tell, to go along with the program. And organized enterprises in human trafficking work the same way. So that's the kind of thing, my colleague to the left here said that, and I think it's very important to say that you've got to expose this kind of thing in order to break up that effort. Well, I think it's important that the UN shifted their emphasis to organized crime. I'm sure all of you know that 79% of the victims of human trafficking in the world are women and children. 1/3 of the victims throughout the world are children. In Africa and also in Southeast Asia, the numbers are more like 60%, 70%. And that's also what it was like in the 19th century in that part of the world. The effort to enslave people in the Indian Ocean world was not based on men to work in plantations, but rather women and children to work as domestic servants, to serve as concubines, to serve in these other kinds of capacities. So the people that think about slavery have talked about this idea of slavery zones or slaving zones, areas where transportation goes on. And that happened in the 19th century, and it happens today. So we should focus on where and how people are transported in these circumstances. I'm going to close with just sort of 3 watchwords, 3 kind of reasons for why this is still happening to a great extent. In fact, the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, which is responsible for educating people and leading the international work against slavery and human trafficking, has pointed out that it's a bigger problem today than it has been in the past. And the first point that I'm going to emphasize is the problem of migration, the problem of tremendous set of people migrating like we've never seen before in human history, and traffickers, organized criminal elements take advantage of that. The second issue as to why this is happening is climate. Disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, other kinds of things like that, which cause great movement of people, and traffickers take advantage of of those kinds of things. The Salvadoran earthquake that happened in 2000, the American government responded to it by giving some immigration benefits based on that, but there were a lot of people who just came because they were escaping the problem of the changing climate and the tremendous suffering caused by the earthquake there. Lastly is conflict, and I'm sure this is not news to many people in the audience here who know about this, but we've seen recently, and this is some of the work I do, actually a revival of de jure or legal slavery among some Islamic groups. Some Islamic groups, ISIS being the best example, but you also have Boko Haram in Nigeria, where they say, under our law, we are permitted to take slaves, especially women, in these circumstances. And the U.S. has been combating that to some extent, but mostly on a terrorism kind of approach, when really the anti-slavery organizations ought to be engaged, in my view, with Islamic scholars, people who know about Islamic law, to deal with that problem as well. Because if we have a revival, there's also a small group in the Philippines that has taken the same position, that as part of their establishment of an Islamic state, they can have slaves, lawful slaves in that state. And so a lot of people might think it's kind of an off-base, or weird, or extreme idea, but the problem is that it leads to an acceptance by the population of slavery, even though they may not say, well, I don't agree with everything that government does, but it kind of lulls us into an acceptance where otherwise we shouldn't agree with it. So I would, in closing, urge all of you, especially students that are in the room, as you become maybe diplomats, or if you go to law school and become a prosecutor, other university students, to really urge the university and your agencies to take the international perspective and to do some study of this history to show that it's really been a continuum from the 19th century, and especially abroad, and that there hasn't been much change. It's a pessimistic thing I would say, that the anti-slavery effort in that part of the world has been a failure.
The true situation in New Jersey is. Now, why is New Jersey, why has it got such a problem? I mean, it is one of the top states, and it should probably be, as we say, higher on that national ranking. Not that we want to be top of this ranking by any means, but we do want federal funds to come to the state to offset what's going on here, because it is a problem. We are a portal state, number one. We have lots of inroads, we've got the ports, we've got the airports, we've got the I-95, which is a big factor. But movement is not required for trafficking. So we've also got Atlantic City, which is an ongoing 24/7, 365 days of the year hotbed of trafficking. And when the coalition's gone down and done outreach to hotels and motels, you can literally just drive along some of these, not the highways, but the small roads which are lined with motels, and you can see it for yourself. You can see the flashy, big car with a bunch of girls and a guy who's in charge, and it's obvious what's happening. So it's 24/7 in Atlantic City. That really does adds to the point, but we've also got proximity to New York and Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Again, big cities, anonymity, high demand. So it's all the time. It's not just Super Bowl, it's just all the time. 4 bases, they work statewide. They've had 400 cases in 3 years. 400 actual case workload. So I don't know how many calls that would have been to make 400 actual cases. Of those 400 cases, the victims ranged in age from 10 to 75. I'll say that again, from 10 to 75, and most of them were sex trafficking victims. But all their calls came from the state hotline. So already you have a sense that the national hotline is not reflecting what the true situation in New Jersey is. issues that we've been facing. I think that first point I mentioned of the dual hotlines is something we have written to the governor-elect before he was inaugurated, and now we are raising with the governor. We need to just get one hotline. We need to have one data stream. So if you're interested in helping to move that issue forward, I do hope you'll reach out to us and you'll work with us on that. There are things in the 2013 legislation that we thought really put us, we were like A-starred on the national rankings for having the best laws. We've got great laws for survivors now. If a survivor has a criminal record because of prostitution, that can be vacated. That's excellent. But we also wanted to tackle demand. Demand is the key. And one of the things we wanted to do was have what was called a prostitution offender program. In some cities and other states, it's called the John School. The John School is something that will have anyone who has purchased a person to be re-educated about who they're purchasing, and that the willing smile is not a willing smile, it is a smile coerced by the pin. And until buyers stop buying because they realize their victims are actually victims, we cannot get a reversal. So that was an important, and a very important thing that still has not been implemented, and now we're nearly 5 years on. So that's not okay. I would say going forward, other things that we would love to see happen is further vacation for victims, because somebody who's being trafficked, prostituted, may commit other small crimes, like they might steal food, because quite honestly, a victim, if you've studied how coercion happens and how somebody is created into a victim, they are first made to feel love, something maybe they're not familiar with, and then they are victimized, but then little bits of love keep being thrown in, and that little bit of love might be a hamburger once a day. So sometimes to survive, survivors have to, victims have to steal, and we need those criminal records vacated also, so that they can actually start a life anew, get a job, and move on with their lives. So there are still many things we'd like to do. One of the really most tragic things that I'm going to leave you with was something that we are currently working on. So in 2013, we tried to stop the trafficking of kids on the internet in New Jersey by putting a piece of our a section of our legislation that stated that anybody putting an ad on Backpage, which is one of the top sites for selling people and children particularly, should prove their age. That was struck down in court in Newark because there was an immunity to Backpage and others through Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. There is now a huge campaign, and if anyone's seen the film I Am Jane Doe, you've heard of the film I Am Jane Doe, I would urge you again, please go on our website. We have a screening actually coming up this week on Wednesday evening at Felician University. And you can see it on Netflix as well. This takes you through the story of young people who are trafficked from middle school, but some of them are 14, 15, and they tried to take Backpage to court and failed every time throughout the country, kept on failing. The only solution to letting these victims and now survivors have their day in court is to amend Section 230 to stop allowing Backpage and others from selling children on the internet with impunity. So that was a big failure. That's something we're working on. We've got a campaign to reach out to the remaining members of Congress in this state who have not signed the relevant bill. Both our senators have signed that bill, and 6 out of 12 of our members of the House of Representatives have signed that bill. If you live in a district that hasn't, please go on our website, check out which one it is, and think about doing so. Think about getting involved with the coalition. Thank you.
To your joy, I'm the last speaker on the panel. I'm Bob Bober at the Slavery Community Project, and our focus is to eradicate slavery and the effects of slavery in our very local community. South Orange, Maplewood, Milburn, Short Hills is our initial focus. And so I think that the fair question is what do we see as the impacts, what do we see as the presence of slavery in our communities? And the first, I think, we're hoping that is limited would be the examples that we heard earlier, actual slavery actually traffic victims in our communities, either people who are sex trafficked, and a large percentage of slavery in this country is domestic servants. We don't know if they're domestic servants who are enslaved in these communities. That would be another presence. Commercial enterprises. We heard about braiding shops, nail salons, restaurants. I don't know that there would be factories in these communities, but that would be another one. But in addition, however, to the actual presence of victims of trafficking, we're looking as to how each of us, including myself, have benefited, have profited from slavery, in the effect of slavery in our community, and that's through international chains of commerce. So, for example, it's been well established that children from the country called Burkina Faso in Africa are trafficked to the adjoining country called Cote d'Ivoire, where they're enslaved on cocoa farms. The difficult thing for abolitionists is it's only a small number, I mean it's a large number, but a small percentage of cocoa farms in Cote d'Ivoire have enslaved children from Burkina Faso or other slaves working on it. But they're there, they harvest the cocoa. The cocoa then, and this is a huge part of the economy of Cote d'Ivoire, the cocoa then gets processed, the cocoa then gets manufactured, and it ends up with someone like Mr. Nestle. So now Mr. Nestle has his chocolate, and he has some percentage of that chocolate which was harvested by slaves. And then Mr. Nestle processes all his chocolate, and he sends it to Mr. King's. And I go to Maplewood, and I go to downtown at Maplewood, and I go to Mr. King's, and I say, Mr. King's, do you have some chocolate for me that Mr. Nestle had? And Mr. King sells me the chocolate. And that's how a tiny little percent comes to me. But it's not just chocolate that we're speaking of. We're also speaking of gold, which is harvested by slaves in Peru, in Ghana, in Central Africa. Where does gold show up? Obviously, gold jewelry. In the same tiny percentages, which goes through these layers, these chains. Also, a lot of people have a device that looks something like this. Okay, I can assure you my device comes from Mr. Samsung. Mr. Samsung does not have a gold mine, which he uses to put the pieces of his telephones together. He gets it from somebody, who gets it from somebody else, who gets it from somebody else, who gets it from the slaves. And so the profit of slaves, the benefit of slaves, comes down through chains to all of us. In addition to chocolate, in addition to gold, we're talking about cotton. We're talking about seafood, which ends up in pet food. So if everybody looks at a can of seafood or a can of pet food and it says seafood, I can pretty well assure you that your kitty or your doggy is not eating hand-raised rainbow trout in their little can of food. They're getting food that people don't eat. And where does it come from? It comes somewhere cheap. And how do you get cheap things? You have cheap labor. And how do you get cheap labor? The cheapest are slaves. Okay? So we have all these products in the stream of commerce. How do we, the Slavery Community Project, think this should be addressed? Now, this is a tough problem, folks, a tough problem. As the professor said, it's existed in recorded history for 4,000 years. Every day, without fail, 4,000 years. It is illegal in every country on earth. There's no country where slavery, as a country, there are pockets where people are doing whatever they're doing. But there's no country where slavery is legal under the laws of the country. It's $150 billion a year in profit from slavery. How are you going to get rid of it? It's not an easy question. By the way, when I finish here today, if someone has the easy solution to eradicate slavery, please, we're all ears. We're all ears. So what we think is that at the local level, we have to have the implementation of what I would call earlier the structures of abolition. So we have laws, we have regulations, we have all sorts of processes which are vital. But how community level, because it's we're in an academic setting now, theory of change. Our theory of change is that at the local level, we have to work together and have every part of society functioning together to eradicate slavery. So for example, we have governments. The township of Maplewood, where I live, has a police department. We want the police to be trained and effective in finding slavery. We want them trained and effective at helping victims of slavery. But the government of Maplewood is also a consumer. When they buy uniforms for the police, it would be nice if the uniforms weren't made of cotton harvested by slaves. So we want the government of Maplewood to be functioning across its totality to eradicate slavery. Now the other side of government, which we're all familiar with to a great extent, are just boards of education and the school system. So what would we want the school system to be doing? We want the school system to have the students aware of modern slavery. We want it, in addition to awareness, integrated into the curriculum. Also, we want the children to talk so they can be protected from being trafficked. And if folks believe that no child from Maplewood or South Orange or Milburn or Short Hills can be trafficked, think again. Think again. And also your school board purchases stuff. They purchase a computer. We want them to screen the computers so that they're not buying computers where you have slavery up the sides that you're selling me. That's what I want. I wanted to know about your shrimp. I want to know about your chocolate. I want to know about the cotton potholders you're selling. Everything that you're selling me, I want to know. And so now, what we're driving toward is a slave-free community. So a slave-free community has an aware population. A slave-free community has a population where the people acting as consumers are demanding that they be given slave-free goods, where the government, the police is working, the school board is working. You have an integrated system to eradicate slavery, because as I said earlier, it's a tough problem. And from our perspective, our theory of change is this is how you're going to eradicate it. And I do believe that we know, we've learned over the last 20, 30 years, particularly in the last 10 even more so, how to eradicate slavery from supply chains, how to address slavery as a criminal enterprise. We know how to do it. The question is, do we have the determination to get up every day and say, I'm going to do everything I can do to eradicate slavery, and then the next day do more? That's how we're going to do it. But we're here today in a university. So I pose the question, what would a slave-free university look like? What would a slave-free university look like? So if I go to the bookstore and I buy a t-shirt at, say, some university, put in any name you want, that says, I like my university, and the t-shirt's made out of cotton, how do we know where the cotton came from? Where the university is buying computers, where the gold in the computers come from? Where you go to art class and you're using gold leaf, where did it come from? And so when you think of a university as a little community, the same issue is posed to a university as a little community. Where does their food come from, the animals in the lab? Where does the chocolate come from when they're serving chocolate somewhere? So that all those questions that I pose for a slave-free community are equally applicable to a university. And so that's what we're trying to do at the Slave-Free Community Project. That's our focus. Our focus is how do we eradicate the slaveries of the 25 million people around the world who are enslaved in forced labor are freed, and the additional 15 million who are in forced marriage are freed. That's our focus. So people say to me sometimes, and I hope all of you are thinking this, what can I do? What can I do that I can do? So I'll give you 4 things. One, Kate mentioned, put the national hotline into your phone. Trust me, if I can do it, anybody can do it. So put the national hotline in your phone. national hotlines for people who are victims who want to contact, or people who see things that are suspicious. Sometimes to find more information, just put it in your phone. You'll have it. You'll have it. Secondly, in New Jersey, we have a new governor. And I feel that I don't want the governor sitting around with nothing to do. And so what we'd like him to do, to a great extent, is work on eradicating modern slavery from the state of New Jersey. So outside, and you may have seen this come in, there's a postcard. And the postcard says, Dear Governor, what are you doing to eradicate slavery from New Jersey? If you sign your name, just tell us the time, we'll mail it for you. Because we would like the governor as engaged as everyone else should be on this issue. And the last thing, third of four, is I'd like people to go to any business you want, anytime you want, and say, how do I know what I'm buying here is free from slavery? There's no slavery up your supply chain. I've done it myself. I remember that I spoke to the manager at Mr. King's. He almost began to cry. He said, this is my last day here. I'm being transferred. He said, can you talk to somebody else? I said, well, I'm here now. I'd like to. And he's like, I said, well, we don't have any slaves in our warehouses. I said, I'm not concerned so much about your warehouses. But start the conversation, because the thing for Mr. King's, what does he care about Bob Boneberg, one guy coming in? He doesn't. But if 100 people come in, then they've got to say this, our consumers want to know. And then you begin to see change. And the very last thing I've asked people to think about is, how much do you want to be involved? And I'm confident, not a shred of a doubt, that as much as you want to be involved, we're happy to have you. Happy to have you. Because I truly believe we're the generation that will end slavery. So in 50 years, the grandchildren or the youngest people in the room will say to their grandparents, what was slavery? What was that? They'll say, that used to exist, but we ended it. We ended it about 25 years ago. And this is what it was. So I hope you'll join with me in that. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Fahim Abadrabo. I'm the Director of Government Relations here at Seton Hall University. Thank you and welcome. Most importantly, thank you to our distinguished panelists for today. Please give another round of applause. And as well, thank you to Dean Bartoli and Dean Halpin, of course, to also one of our other deans who was not on the stage, but is an integral part and leader within diplomacy. Courtney? No, you can give him applause. So before we continue, we are going to have a Q&A, but wanted to just give some notations around the room. There is some information regarding human trafficking as well as legislation that Congressman Smith either has. First question.
Hi, I'm Patricia. My question is for Dr. Freeman. During your years of research in the Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, and Arabian Peninsula, could you count with any help of the government of the states in the areas or not? Thank you.
Oftentimes what the governments do is what I describe, I'm a little critical, others may not agree with me, but oftentimes what the governments do I would describe as window dressing, that when there's international pressure, like right now on Qatar, which is having the World Cup, so they established a slavery museum in Doha. Although there were families in Doha that wanted to make sure that their name was not mentioned in the museum as coming from slaveholding families. So there's an embarrassment that goes on. And so the government is careful not to embarrass or expose elites, because like with organized crime, the people that ran slavery in that part of the world were generally economic elites.
wealthy people. So, and that's still the case today. So in the Persian Gulf, most, I think, of the anti-human trafficking legislation is window dressing, although sometimes the governments will conduct a raid, make arrests, and do it with press releases to try to impress the world that they're trying to do what they can. Jordan is a little better than some of the others, but not as good as they should be. In Africa, there are some governments that have actually been very aggressive in terms of trafficking, but again, it depends on the political situation. Trafficking is an international political issue, and so the governments are always paying attention. They want to be high up in the U.S. report that comes out once a year, and so they do diplomatic things to try to get a good rating in the TIP report. So it depends on the government and what the politics are at the moment. India has been very bad, I would say, and ignores oftentimes much forced labor in Indian industries. They just ignore it.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Claire Yoakum and I'm a student at Seton Hall, and my question could go to any of you. What are some traits or red flags to look at in order to prevent human trafficking or slavery?
Well, actually, I could point you, if you take your phone and go to the front desk, there's actually a flyer there which has got some basic red flags, and you can find that on the Coalition's website as well. But oftentimes, this is particularly toward red flags towards labour and sex trafficking domestically, and things like lack of eye contact, or somebody that doesn't seem to be speaking for themselves, or even a young person getting gifts inappropriately. These are a number of the red flags. I would also say, if you do go on our website, we have very comprehensive and far more detailed red flags that we provide for hotels and motels, both for the front desk and housekeeping staff. We've now got those in 8 languages, about to be a 9th language, and so if you're interested to even look at them in other languages and care about the hotels and motels, get involved with our SOAP program, which takes these soap bars to hotels and motels, and you can check out the website for those translations.
Also, don't think that the traffickers are all men. There are many women who traffic other women. So oftentimes a woman is able to disguise her role because she's a woman, and you would never suspect that a woman would be involved in trafficking children and women.
Yeah, just to add to that, the case I mentioned, the hair braiding in Newark, was run by a woman.
And I'd just like to add that my daughter experienced having females and males alike, and as a healthcare professional, I think it's truly important for all to realize that you should take a look at those red flags as stated.
Hello, my name is Louise Murray. I too am a member of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. Mrs. Johnson, it's nice to see you again. When I've heard you speak earlier, you've mentioned your experience with your local law enforcement. And we in the Coalition want to get the word out so that others don't experience what you had. And I wondered if Mrs. Lee wanted to mention some of the other work we're doing with the local precincts, because I think they're important pieces.
Thank you for that question. I'd like to say that, first of all, our experience was over 10 years ago, and I did not, even myself, I hadn't heard of human trafficking. And although law enforcement was genuinely very concerned and very nice, they really did not know what to do. Since that time, a lot of trainings have gone forth, as Congressman Chris Smith has alluded to, and the Coalition has been involved with taking the legislation to the next step to continue that human trafficking one-on-one type training. But you also need another step, because we can all be trained, but then you need the action steps that go behind this. I'll let Kate follow up to that.
Yeah, I think training is one of the big things we've been following for a number of years, and it was one of the cornerstones of that 2013 piece of legislation. We've not always been happy that it's been fully implemented it in law enforcement particularly because you see very spotty situations occur. I mean, something that broke my heart this past summer was reading a piece on NJ.com which was blasting the names and faces and ages and of victims, of prostitutes. They were called prostitutes, but without a doubt, all the prosecutors we know have said they have never come across a case where in a prostitution situation there was not a third party, i.e. there was not a pimp or a trafficker. So therefore, when Passaic County puts these names and shames, effectively victims, we have gone back in time, and I think since then the Attorney General's office did issue a directive to the counties to say do better prosecutions, but sometimes it's for us to do the work. And in fact, one of our member organizations, we have 150 member organizations, but some really amazingly active ones in this part of northern New Jersey, NCJW, the NCJW? National Jewish Women, Council of Jewish Women, I all know them by that acronym. They have done they're doing an amazing program where they're going in Essex County to police department by police department and asking them if they've been trained. Because only by actually going, it's like going to Mr. King's and asking him the question, only by going to your police department and asking what they've done and what they know, can you be sure that it is across our state. So it really is very much in everybody's hands to be able to make a difference here. And so do partner up with organizations doing this work, do see what you can do together, and know that you can make a difference.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Linda Beck. I'm part of the Slave Free Community Project. I have two questions, one for Ms. Lee and Ms. Johnson, and the other for Dr. Freeman. The first one for the ladies is, can you talk a little bit about the terminology that we're using? The terms that we use for the women are whore, hoe, slut, prostitute, and yet we call the men Johns. I know plenty of Johns, and they're nice guys. I just wonder what our thoughts are there. I know there's been a big movement to stop glorifying the word pimp, stop saying pimp my ride, pimp my crib, things like that. And then for Dr. Freeman, I wonder if you could give us an idea of how the price of buying a human being has changed over the past years.
So I'll start by saying that I believe in being real and keeping it real, and that too many times we dress things up to disguise them as some elusive situation. And so the language that's being used is not language that Kate and I created. It's language that the streets and the people who are doing this type of work, they created. And the reason why victims could not be found is because people weren't educated on the language. It is the language that draws this business out in the communities and keeps it so underground. And so that's what I would say about the language and the importance of understanding the real deal about human trafficking. Trafficking on any form, we should learn and understand the language that's being used out there.
But we have this conversation a lot about the word pimp. You know, one year apparently baby pimp was the top Halloween costume. So as a society, we need to stop doing this. We up here, we alone cannot do it. We all, as a community and a society, need to stop glorifying pimps and demonizing women and making them, you know, seem like it's their fault. Of course it's not. We have to really understand prostitution is not this victimless crime. We do have to try to, but again, as you know, Ingrid said, we've got to talk about what words are going to matter if you're going to discuss it for real, and that does mean we have to understand kind of ugly language, because the ugly language is definitely, I mean, I have not used some of the ugly language that is out there, but it is certainly there, and we do need to, if you're going to engage with young people, for them to understand. Many victims do not understand their victims. And I think that we don't need to hide behind sanitized language. We actually have to talk to them about things they're hearing. The word daddy is a name for a pimp. So if you see a tattoo with daddy's girl, but we have to understand one of the ways to ask a girl is, you know, have you got a daddy? And that might mean something completely different to them. So yeah, we have to look at it from both sides. Let's be real, but let's also understand we could make a difference in stopping some of this cultural craziness in terms of pimping this and that.
As to the second question, it's a complicated answer to that question. The most important work, I think, that's been done on that issue of the price of slaves was the argument made by Kevin Bales in his book, Disposable People, where he argues that in the 19th century, at least in America, and this is so also largely so in the Indian Ocean world, mostly, but not always, a slave was expensive because since slavery was lawful or recognized as a lawful thing in most communities, you had the obligation to feed, clothe, give medical care, dental care, house the slave. So when you purchased a slave, it was like an investment in a form of labor that you had to get something back on your investment, so it cost a lot. Now, slaves in most parts of the world apparently are very cheap. Now the economic circumstances in the globe have changed, so you have globalization and these other economic things which have changed the way that commodities are priced. So it's difficult to make a one-on-one comparison. But for example, in this recent CNN expose involving the sale of men who were migrants who came into Libya and they were sold in an auction, they were going to work in various places. The mine holders were buying them in an auction for around $700, $600. I think it was dollars, I'm not sure. It might have been Libyan currency, but somewhere in that range, which is not cheap for a worker, but also not at the same cost as it would have been in the 19th century. So my general answer, depending on the circumstance, is that slaves are much cheaper now because they're disposable, as Bales points out, both in sex trafficking and with forced labor. When the person collapses or is no longer as useful, you just discard them and get another one. And that's because of migration, and there's so many people available who don't have economic means and will actually be trafficked because of that. But there are examples from the 19th century where slaves were bought and sold also cheaply. So it's not completely sure. It's hard to make the comparison.
Can I just add one thing too? Just while on the streets of New York, when I went into a police station with my daughter's picture and just put my hand out, the officer began to talk to me about prostitution as if that was going to stop me from getting people to do their job, which was to help me find my child. I thank God he struck me on the streets posting flyers to get over the words, to get over that issue of the language, to get over my uncomfortableness while I'm out there searching for some unknown situation. And when I got over that, I was able to walk in that police precinct, and when I put my hand out and he began to talk to me about prostitution, I said, okay, and what's next? What's next? Get beyond the words and let's get to helping people. And how do we get beyond that and what's next? Great question.
If I may just add something with respect to the price of slavery. There's a popularly written book called A Crime So Monstrous by a fellow named Ben Skinner. It came out a few years ago, Crime So Monstrous. And he discusses, from his perspective and his research, that it's more expensive to fly to Haiti than it is to buy a slave in Haiti. So there's this practice in Haiti called Restavek, practices enslaving children. And so from Ben Skinner's perspective, it would cost you more to get to Haiti than to get your slave in Haiti. So.
I was just going to say one more thing about things you can do when you see language. There's one piece of language that we have an internship program that we run during January's Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and in that orientation for our interns, we had about 13 or 14 interns. They had a sort of pop quiz, a Jeopardy quiz, and one of the questions was, what is a teenage prostitute? It was a trick question.
There is no such thing. And if you do see it in the newspapers, if you read teenage prostitute, please, would you just email your editor and say, under the age of 18, you're automatically a victim of human trafficking. You don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. I thought it was a real moment for those students, and I think it should be a moment for all of us that we mustn't use language like that. So, although bravely Ingrid said, just get over it, so what? But however, it's just not accurate. It's not right. A prostituted child is not the same as a teenage prostitute.
Good afternoon, my name is Alyssa Futa. I'm currently a student here at Seton Hall. We talked a lot about what the state of New Jersey is doing regarding the issue of human trafficking. However, I'm sure a number of us in the room are not from New Jersey or even from out of the country. And I was wondering what things that we can do as we take this conversation back home, and what we can do to raise awareness and help with this issue.
Great questions. I'll start by saying that many around the tables through the years that I've been involved in human trafficking were not from the state of New Jersey. Many have come, many have left us and returned to their home states or countries. There are many doctoral students that are among the midst fighting this battle across the world. I had the pleasure of visiting the United Nations and to see what difference the world can make about human trafficking. So I would say to you that the things we're saying today are not just particular to the state of New Jersey. This level of activism and advocacy can be done and should be done everywhere across the globe.
Yes, absolutely. There are coalitions throughout the country. There are organizations working everywhere. If you're from New York City particularly has a number of organizations. But I particularly would be interested to see, still go on our website and look at that federal piece of legislation, the amendment to the CDA. If you go on our website today, there's a great little PSA done by Amy Schumer and some of the other celebrities. It's very moving, powerful. So that's something that's across the board. We should all not let federal legislation mean that it's okay to sell kids on the internet. So it doesn't matter where you live, make that happen.
And I also add that for me, this was about being a woman. This wasn't about New Jersey. It wasn't about us being from Irvington or the Newark area. This was about the rights of a woman, the rights of a child to grow up and be an independent, functioning, productive part of our society and of our world. And I refused to sit down to that point. I didn't know what my daughter really wanted to be. I didn't know where she would want to travel, but I knew for sure that too many women across the globe let circumstances hold them back. We don't tell the truth about them because we're taught to be quiet and silent. And so I think we need to break the silence across the globe, and that is universal, that we need to be able to free ourselves and participate in that freedom across the globe.
Hi, my name is Mark, and this is for Dr. Freeman. I've always, been under the impression that Qatar was, a very strong sponsor of terrorism. And I know you'd mentioned, the country a few times today. And just recently, I was reading somewhere that they actually hired an Orthodox Jewish company to help, with their PR, and they've invited a number of Jewish different sources to come to the country to meet with them. And I was just wondering what your opinion on that was, if that was just a facade and, they're just trying to, basically hoodwink everybody, or there was some truth to that.
I think that there are genuinely anti-slavery. I can't talk about other aspects of Qatar foreign policy. You know that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, and I believe one other country, they instituted a boycott of Qatar for various reasons. So there are other aspects of their foreign policy that I can't comment on because I'm not an expert on it. But in terms of anti-slavery, there has been in Qatar some people who have realized that that part of the world, they have a very bad history and they want to correct the history. And so they hire public relations people and other people to try to cleanse their face to the world. But on the other hand, there's a deeply ingrained system of economic exploitation and domination from a small elite dominating a very large, not very large, but a fair number of people from the Indian subcontinent, from Africa, and from Iran, and other places that are working in very bad conditions. Now, I think that's improved. I haven't done a survey recently. I hear that it's improved, but they still have a long way to go. And I don't know about the thing that you comment about hiring a Jewish company. I'm not sure about that. I know Qatar right now is doing better in terms of anti-trafficking, probably than the other Persian Gulf countries, but they're also in trouble. They're all related, you know, by way of family. The elites are related to each other, and they're right now the bad boy in Persian Gulf, and I'm not sure why. Qatar citizens were removed from Saudi Arabia. They had to go home. They can't fly. They can't come into Dubai, which is a big economic engine. Dubai, that's one thing I would do. I would not go to Dubai. I would boycott Dubai because of the trafficking that goes on there. And so Qatar is, I think, doing better, but they have a long way to go.
Thanks, Freeman.
My name is Charlotte Malenga. So, first of all, I thank all panelists for their relevant intervention. So my question is addressed to all of panelists. My question is because you spoke about slavery, human trafficking, but my question is how do you interlink those two phenomena, slavery and human trafficking? Because I see that through human trafficking there is also a kind of slavery also, sexual slave, and even through the immigration, because you spoke about immigration. Through the immigration also there is a kind of slavery also. So how do you interlink those two phenomena? That's the first question. The second question is that among children of African descent, we see that there is a lack of knowledge of their identity and culture. When Sheila Walker intervened at the UN, Sheila said that in the Brooklyn College, the students, they wanted the education for the true narrative. But my question is, if the students want the education of their narrative, what role the parents do in order to tell their children their identity and their culture? Thank you.
I'm just going to answer the first part of that question. Human trafficking is a form of modern day slavery. But slavery is a bigger picture. So the human trafficking part of slavery is the forced labor and forced sexual exploitation. But there's more than that. So when the International Labour Organization, I think they put the number at like 40 million in total, what they're including, so 25 million of those are human trafficking. So human trafficking forms the largest component of modern slavery. But the other part of that is forced marriage, because that's not always human trafficking, because things like, there has to be some sort of value, there's some sort of exchange of value with trafficking. So that's why most slavery is trafficking, but not all slavery is human trafficking, if that makes sense. So, for example, in a forced marriage situation, sometimes that turns into domestic servitude, which is human trafficking, and sometimes it's just slavery, but it's not defined as that commercial side. I hope that explains that it's definitely, they are the same pie. Human trafficking is just a large piece of that pie.
I would agree with that. The Palermo Protocol definition, there have been issues with the definition of slavery that have complicated the problem. It hasn't made it easier, it's made it more difficult because the definition of slavery has changed from the 19th century. So I agree that human trafficking is a new crime, and it includes slavery, but it also would include other things. And then you can have slavery that's not trafficking, that is not defined as trafficking. So in some ways, it doesn't make sense to link them, but to identify them carefully, to make a careful identification. For example, another one is forced begging. Kids are forced to beg, sometimes for religious reasons. They're brought into a religious circumstance, and the religious teacher forces them to go out and beg on the street. That's not necessarily slavery. The kid may be doing it voluntarily because he thinks that he's going to go to heaven if he does this begging. So that may not be slavery, but it is trafficking. And then on the other hand, as my colleague says, forced marriage, where you force a woman to marry you, is both, is a form of slavery. Kevin Bales has a good example of what slavery is. The question is, can the person walk away from it? If the person cannot walk away without serious consequences, either legal or psychological or coercive consequences, then their liberty is denied, and then you would define that as a form of slavery. So the definitions are difficult, and it's hard to answer that question.
I would just also agree with what was already said.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer. I think some of the dominant narratives of human trafficking involve kind of stranger danger of someone external to a situation, either kidnapping or seducing someone away from their maybe home in order to engage in this kind of activity or forced work. But I'm wondering if anybody on the panel can speak to situations of human trafficking that begin within the home context. So I think this is something we don't want to acknowledge happens. And someone that I know experienced human trafficking as a young person because her mother was poor and used drugs and alcohol and needed to make money. And so I'm wondering if anybody in the panel wants to talk about human trafficking that happens maybe emanating from the home as a result of drug and alcohol use or violence in the home context. Thank you.
I would say, in fact, it's getting worse. That scenario is growing, and unfortunately it's going hand in hand with the opioid epidemic. Certainly the results of the FBI's cross-country operation are showing that not only is it more in the home, but the children involved are younger. So it's something we should definitely, it's alarming and horrific. So yes, there is, of course, there's all ways people can be lured, or they can seemingly want to volunteer to be trafficked. But absolutely, when they're in the home, it's so difficult. So I so agree with that, and I wish I knew what we can do about it. But we do need to look at some of these bigger problems like the opioid epidemic and see that they're very linked.
I would just add that the definition of home even varies from person to person and place to place. And stranger danger becomes, that's my uncle, auntie, my best friend, and you don't even know these people. You know, so I think that, again, there's no one answer to that, but you go from stranger danger to, that's my auntie, my uncle, my daddy, in the street language. And then those folks become, well, look, I can let you go, but they begin to turn the table and the tide to say, well, who really cares about you anyway? You know, and belittle you. And so then they make themselves almost fit the definition of family. It's very dangerous.
Thank you. Before we go to the last two, I'm going to ask you both, if you don't mind, can I ask your question?
Good afternoon. My name is Marcial. We can agree probably that the definition of slavery varies from different folks and so on and so forth, but we do agree that prostitution, forced begging, human trafficking, that they are criminal enterprises. We can agree to that. But one thing that's absent today on historical slavery is that historically slavery was organized, administered, financed, controlled, supervised for the support and benefits of European powers. That's absent now today. Aren't we making a mockery of the word slavery, of its historical context, when you have the absence of organized world powers using black labor for white wealth, white privilege that we are living now today? Aren't we minimizing, reducing the word slavery as we know it historically? Aren't we?
Very vigorous response to that question. The definition of slavery that you have given us, my good friend, is from the Western Hemisphere's history of slavery. If you look at slavery in other parts of the world, even during the 19th century, it wasn't run by governments or by organizations designed to bring wealth to whites. Wealth to elites, but those elites weren't always white. They might be Indian Rajas or Arab sheikhs or Southeast Asian kings. So the argument has been made that by talking about modern day slavery now we diminish the horrific history of transatlantic slavery that African Americans and to some extent Native Americans went through. But that doesn't diminish the fact that slavery existed elsewhere. It just wasn't paid attention to. The British kind of woke up in the late 19th century and then tried to deal with it. But so it's not always about this idea of bringing wealth only to whites.
My daughter had an experience while she was working with Pathmark, so we can talk about them because they're closed, right? So she worked at Pathmark. We had done a public speaking venue that was on the public news stations, and she went to work and someone began to tease and taunt her, calling at her out of her name. So I bring that to your attention to say that enslavement is also a mindset, isn't it? It's a belief that you also begin to take on upon yourself. And then the perpetrator may be long gone, but you're living, acting, breathing like you're a slave to something. And so as we talk about movements for all people, but including women to be free, that freedom is to unleash that mindset of enslavement and to truly, truly live a free and full life to the best of your capacity. And so slavery is a mindset, and it encompasses bigger. The body of slavery is larger than what I believe you described.
I really agree with that. The idea of the importance of the idea of deprivation of liberty doesn't have a race or a gender or a nationality. Someone who's deprived of their liberty, that is the beginning of the definition of slavery, and it doesn't have to do necessarily with all these other things. So it can happen in the Pathmark, like with her daughter, or it might happen in some field in India or in China. It's still slavery.
Last question, please.
Hi, my name is Henry Davis. This question is for Ms. Ingrid Johnson. Unfortunately, I found within the black community, when you mention the word slavery, they only think about it in history and what has happened in America in history. But in the desire to raise awareness about what is happening now, have you found very effective ways of ministering this information to people within the black community, in churches, and what has been the most effective way of raising the awareness of this horrible subject?
Thank you for asking that question. Being real, meeting people where they are, not being judgmental, and active listening. When you really have communication and you communicate with someone and you really get down to the core of what their issue is, it is about all of this stuff, right? We can implement slavery type mentalities on ourselves, right? We can decide we don't want a college education because we just simply can't do it. I just can't do it. Because somebody may have also reinforced that negativity that I just cannot make it. So young women who I mentor have problems in the home with their families. And when I begin to tell them about the story of my daughter and I, they get something from that. So what I've learned in over 10 years is that human trafficking is just one of many atrocities in this world. But when you open up that discussion with others, men and women alike, they begin to listen, then they'll share another story, because it's storytelling, right? And then you begin to see the common bond, which goes to, I can do all things with He that strengthens